Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Danger Zone, the Terrible Infant Movies and TV podcast. I'm Will. We have Mike in the studio with us.
Hey, how you doing?
And for the first time ever, we have Logan Williams. Say hello.
Hello.
Just by way of introduction, Logan has an MFA in film production, so I guess coming from the technical side, at least in part. He worked on a Vietnamese singing competition show, is that correct? That shot in California?
Yes. Garden Grove, by the way.
Big-time vinyl collector and Laserdisc collector, which will be pertinent to this episode. And then also is in the process of producing, and you'll also be directing, is that correct, this show? It's called Tiny Studio, presented by the Jump Off Sound. And it's a live reality show featuring live acts, like musicians, poetry, stuff like that.
Just a live variety show.
And then there will be edited versions of it on YouTube. So keep an eye out for that. So today's topic is film scores and film composers, I guess also. And this is a very, very broad subject. And we're going to cover a lot of ground. And we're going to go into detail on some of our favorite composers. We're going to try to mention some of the biggest of all time. We're going to talk about our favorite types of film scores. But you should all be forewarned before we start this that there are basically as many film scores as there are movies, right? So there's hundreds of thousands of film scores. There's thousands and thousands of composers. And we're going to try to do our best to cover the big ones. And at some point, we might do another one of these. Like, I don't have a lot of stuff here on silent film. I was reading about the people who did the music for, like German Expressionist films and stuff like that, but we're probably not going to really get into that. So maybe we'll do another one of these down the line if people respond to it well. But so as a starting point, I thought I would pick someone who Logan is actually wearing a shirt for right now, who Mike is a big fan of, I think we're all big fans of, and who is very influential on film scores from the past like 30 to 40 years. That is John Carpenter. He did the scores for Halloween 1 through 3. He did The Fog, Escape from New York, The Thing, Assault on Precinct 13, They Live, Prince of Darkness. He started using synthesizers, I was reading today, with his very first film, which is called Dark Star, which I haven't even seen.
75, I think.
And right? He was one of the earliest adopters of synthesizers for film scores. And there's a quote from him saying that he wanted to sound as big as he could with just a keyboard. And so he gravitated towards synthesizers. And he worked with a guy named Alan Howarth.
Howarth, yes.
Yeah. So, and what they did was John Carpenter would write the music, and Alan Howarth, according to what I was reading, would deal with the technical aspects of like recording it. Like, how do I get the sound that he wants out of the synthesizers? How do we record it in the way that he wants it to sound, and things of that nature. And I mean, he is hugely influential on film scores, going all through the 80s with all that synthesizer stuff, up through things we have now with like Stranger Things. And also, essentially, him and other composers of that era, who we'll mention after we talk about John Carpenter, influenced basically an entire subgenre of music, which is like synthwave, retro wave, dark synth, like all of that stuff. And all like Perturbator, Ghost, all of those guys mention John Carpenter as a major influence. So if you guys want to just jump in.
Yeah. I always wonder what was his reasoning for... Because, a lot of directors work with composers and they go and get someone to compose their music for them. I wonder what was his reasoning for doing his own.
I heard, sorry to interrupt, I was going to speak on this before you started, that he said he didn't want sort of to tell the composer the way he wanted his music, so he said, I'll just do it myself. I think it was more just the idea that he can do it himself, and it saved tons of money, obviously. But I think it was more of a sort of for budgeting purposes, as like I can do this myself, as opposed to telling this guy what I want.
It also saves, like
go
back and forth, and like
Yeah, I think I imagine he could, so it was something to do with having a bit more control over his finished product. But you mentioned money, which like right now everyone, when you say John Carpenter, they know him. They don't realize, I think, that when he first started out, he was making very independent films.
Super low budget, like Assault on Precinct 13.
It was basically a student film. I think he had like $100,000 or $50,000 or some low. Even Halloween was under $1 million, I think, for the total budget. So I mean, when your budget is say $1 million and you have you're paying actors, you're paying crew, you really don't have much money left for composers. So you're looking for any way to save money. And the scores, especially for Halloween, it's pretty simple. Like, it's not super complicated. But if you think back, like, a lot of the at least the really big scores that I like are pretty simple. Like, I really like The Thing. And that's like two notes, like bum, bum, It's like so simple.
Well, Jaws too, right?
Jaws.
Like, but I mean, the thing that I think that John Carpenter does so well, and what the thing I think that synthesizers are so good for, it's ominous. It's like dark and it's brooding and it's ominous, and I think it's a lot because it's a synthetic sound. I think it's easier to get that type of like brooding, ominous darkness than it would be to try to communicate with like a cellist or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's also like you meant, it's like unnatural, right? Yeah. And it's like these supernatural killers, and I know Halloween is not supernatural, but come on, like he gets shot, he's not dead. It's there's some supernatural elements to it, obviously, and it's almost the case for almost all horror films. So doing something like a music, like you said, like you wouldn't want something really super classical or like instruments that you can tell. You want something like you have to like really think about what is making that noise, and it's sort of like you said, it's a very unnatural, very eerie feeling that you can invoke, which is I think in horror films, especially in which we mentioned John Carpenter, and that's kind of what he's known for. The music is super important. Like it sets the mood for the whole film,
and it almost becomes like I'm thinking specifically of The Fog. But like the washes of the synthesizer sound is like the arrival of the fog. Yeah, it's like the perfect symbiosis of the image and the music.
Yeah. Right. And the sound too is much quicker than say these large sweeping pieces that we're always. Maybe we're going to talk about this later on, but all these other scores from the 70s and 80s and even 90s before getting into the 2000s had. You can make the music very quickly as opposed to writing all these pieces for all the different instruments and then they come together.
And like having to assemble an orchestra.
Which are good in their own right, but like we were saying, budgeting time and all that, like it can create its own world and then you don't have to worry about it so much. You can focus on the film too.
Well, and even with, and this is something that Mike mentioned to me earlier as we were talking about this, and we'll get to these types of composers later on in our conversation, but just jumping off what you're saying, like, now you just need a laptop and you can make a score for a whole movie. Obviously back then, and like in a minute we're going to talk about Apocalypse Now. Like if you watch the footage about the making of the score for that film, they were using synthesizers that were like 8 feet tall. Like it was like labor intensive to some degree, but you're right. You're not assembling an orchestra and being like printing sheet music and like all of that stuff.
And you don't have to like know precisely where each group of instruments have to come in, and if they're off by like a second, it's no good. You can control everything. It's a lot easier to sort of get the exact sound you want versus having a 50 or 100 person orchestra live and you're recording this music and probably over and over and over and over again until it's perfect. I feel something like that. I don't want to diminish anyone's hard work, but I imagine something like that is just incrementally more difficult than putting something together on your own and not having to depend on anybody else, and you can just like sit there at your computer, put it all together, and boom, you have a score.
Right. And before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about Wendy Carlos for the score for Clockwork Orange, which kind of was very seminal if you want to talk about electronic music and sort of this push into that. And I don't know maybe if John Carpenter had any inspiration from Wendy Carlos, but if we look at Clockwork Orange and taking sort of the compositions from Bach, or no, was it Ludwig for the whole movie, or were there different compositions?
Mostly Beethoven, right?
Beethoven,
but there's
right.
different. Yeah, what's
Beethoven, right? Beethoven's fifth, right? Okay.
I find Wendy Carlos' music really interesting because Tron is another movie.
Yes,
and I was listening to some of the Tron stuff today, like been preparing to do this, and it has, and again, like we're talking about transposing Beethoven to synthesizer, it has a very classical sound. So it's like it's using a new instrument, but it's not creating a new lexicon for like popular music.
Right.
Whereas I feel like people like John Carpenter, Tangerine Dream, if we want to talk about them.
Oh, yes.
Michel Rubini, who I think who did the Manhunter score, Angelo Badalamenti, who did Twin Peaks, Blue Velvet, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, like a lot of stuff like that. Like, and then one of Mike's favorites,
funny, he did
Vangelis.
Yeah, he did the score for The Last of Us too, the game.
Which we're not really going to talk about, but it's a very cinematic game. A lot of these composers later in their life did some video game soundtracks
Tangerine Dream did. So Tangerine Dream was a German electronic band that's founded.
They did San Andreas, right?
Started in the 60s. They did Grand Theft Auto 5.
Yes.
but they did Sorcerer, they did Thief, they did The Keep, they did Legend, Firestarter, Near Dark. I mean, I think they've done like 60 plus film scores, and they're another group. They're like people who do modern music of this type. The guys who do the Stranger Things score, Perturbator, other people who do that. Like they always reference Tangerine Dream, and their music to me differs from Carpenter, and I'm thinking of The Keep in particular because Mike and I watched that not too long ago. But it has this kind of like spectral quality. Yeah. Carpenter stuff is like, to me, is like bassy and brooding, and Tangerine Dream is more like almost like, I think of like space and like sci-fi stuff,
which
and
I really like a lot. The Keep was a very weird sort of movie, and there was a lot of really weird things happening in it, so the music had to kind of fit, and it's almost like dreamlike, you know, dreamlike quality, which fit the tone of the film, because like half the time you're like, what am I watching here? This is so weird.
Bringing up another, or staying on the subject of synths, is Goblin a synth band? I feel like.
Yeah, so I have Goblin on here. Okay. Goblin is interesting because Goblin, and there's a guy named Fabio Frizzi who did Zombie 2, and he worked a lot with Fulci, and then there's a couple other people who were like
Argento as well.
They're all kind of like thrown into this early synth like wave of influencers, but when I listen to Goblin, to me is like it's like psychedelic music with synthesizers. So I think like I would think of them in the same breath that I would think of like, you know, Aphrodite's Child, which is Vangelis's band before he became a film scorer.
With me,
and
Goblin
like,
is weird because obviously I think the big one they know for is Suspiria, right? And everyone
and they did Zombie, and they did the European version of Dawn of the Dead.
Not a big fan of Suspiria. I get the cool colors and the look of it and the sound of it, but it just, to me, it wasn't the greatest movie in the world. And so the music that wasn't for me versus like a lot of the other stuff.
When I listen to it, I do understand why, if you're someone who's screwing around with synthesizers, you would list them as an influence. But I don't hear it as synthesizer music in the same way that I listen to John Carpenter. I'm like, that's synthesizer music. I hear it as like psychedelic music with synthesizers in it, almost like what Pink Floyd would do. Or like,
saying that, I did like their work in Zombie 2 quite a bit, but it felt different than Suspiria. Suspiria had a very unique sound to it, and it's I feel like it's a sound that you either love it or you hate it. It's not much middle ground in there. And I unfortunately fall on I did not like it very much. But that might just be because I didn't like the movie very much.
Okay. But to me, Goblin does not go... Like, if I'm going to listen to psychedelic music, I would rather listen to stuff that goes really, really deep into psychedelia. Whereas Goblin, to me, is not... They're not, like, full-blown, like, really out there.
Take that with a caveat if you love Goblin.
Yeah.
It's just not my kind of film.
We're not hating on Goblin. It's just not... So... I do want to mention, before I move to the next little thing here, I mentioned Apocalypse Now. So I'm a huge fan of Apocalypse Now. And so the history of the music for that movie is that Francis Ford Coppola really wanted Isao Tomita, who was like a very early adopter of synthesizers, like John Carpenter, and who his music is actually, and if you've seen Heaven Knows What, which is by the brothers who did Good Time, that movie with Robert Pattinson. There's a movie they did before that. His music is in that movie. So Coppola wanted him to do the whole score for Apocalypse Now, but he was in a contract with RCA in Japan that would not allow him to do the score. So Coppola, and I watched a documentary about this is how I know all this stuff. Coppola's dad is a musician. And so Coppola had his dad come into the studio with his clarinet, and Coppola sang to his dad what he wanted the score to be, and his dad played it on his clarinet, wrote it down, and then they brought in like 8 or 9 synthesizer players because it was still an emerging instrument at the time, and they had those huge, if you've seen those things, they're like 8 to 10 feet tall, and they have all these different holes on them, and
you patch them,
right? Put patches in them to get the different sounds. There's all this footage of all these people trying to find the exact sound that Coppola's trying to get, and then they're taking the music that his dad has written down and playing it on these synthesizers. It's just crazy, yeah.
Now you can do it on your laptop.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I mean, computers used to be,
room size, right? Yeah.
And now it's like your phone is infinitely more powerful than
everyone's vision of the future was incorrect. Right?
Yeah. I mean, we're still not flying.
Vangelis. Yeah. If we're going to talk about... So Vangelis was in... And we're going to get into some of these film composers who were in bands before they became film composers, because there's a handful of them who are really famous as film composers. Vangelis was kind of the mastermind of Aphrodite's Child, which is a Greek psychedelic band. It put out this really great album called 666. It's kind of like a cult classic. And did the score for, most famously, Blade Runner and Chariots of Fire.
Yeah, I think so.
And then also Missing, a couple of them movies. But, I mean, Blade Runner is so influential in so many ways.
I think Blade Runner is what people know them for. Chariots of Fire, I think everyone's heard the theme. The Chariots of Fire.
Is that thing, right?
So everyone's heard that, but I think...
I thought that was ludicrous. Slow motion for you. Slow motion.
But I think Blade Runner is really what they're known for. And to me, Blade Runner is... I really like the film quite a bit. I wouldn't say it's like my favorite film of all time.
You got that giant poster, though.
I do have the giant poster because I do like the film. I'm a really big fan of cyberpunk and futuristic sci-fi type stuff, and I really like the visuals of Blade Runner, and I really like the music of Blade Runner. It's probably one of my top 2 or 3 soundtracks of all time from any movie ever. Right up there with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which we'll probably talk about a little later,
into that,
and a couple other stuff. But to me, and we were talking about this earlier, what makes a great score is I can listen to that whole score, which I have just without watching the movie, and I know exactly what scene is happening in the movie because the music is so tied to the movie that, you know, when he's sitting at his computer and looking at the photograph, and there's just certain music there, and then when he's done with that, and he steps. He kind of has like this realization what's going on, and like the music kind of opens up, and he steps onto the world and gets the noodles and stuff like that. It's like you can remember it, and it's like almost every time you hear that soundtrack, you're like playing the movie back in your mind, and that's the kind of stuff.
I'm just thinking about noodles now.
Well, yeah.
Am I an android?
I just want some.
You could be, but it's just like that's one of my favorite scores of all time. It's very synthy as well, kind of, right?
Well, so from the same era.
Yeah.
It's very airy. It's very airy.
It's
very spacey sound. Right?
Yeah.
And I really like that.
And it's so like. So I saw Blade Runner kind of late. I was like in my mid-20s maybe when I saw it, so it was like 2007-ish.
With the final cut?
And I don't remember because I've seen 3 different versions of it, and I don't know which one is which, because there may have been
I think the theatrical
animals involved in nearly every time that I've seen that movie.
Voiceover version?
But
that's the theatrical one, right? Yeah.
It was just so, like, as soon as the music started, I felt like I was in the 80s. Like, it just took me back, like, immediately. It's so evocative of when it's from.
Yeah.
So, speaking of the 80s and synthesizers, Terminator. We should probably mention briefly Brad Friedel, right? Terminator is really interesting to me because the theme is in Terminator 1, right? Like the dun, 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 dun. That is like this. Yeah, but that's like this.
Wait, is that T2 or is that T1?
It's right? In T2 as like a more flushed out, like epic version, but it is in Terminator 1. Okay. And that's like, when I think of that, I think of like a classic, like high concept movie theme, right? That you could have written like for an orchestra as much as with synthesizers. It's so much of the Terminator score is so synthy. It's like this interesting kind of in between.
Terminator is fun because like honestly half of the stuff the music I remember from Terminator, you know, is the theme and all that stuff. But then just like simple stuff like when he's going to the nightclub in the beginning and he's kind of looking around and all it is, it's like it's like 1 or 2 notes, and it's just like, and then he starts like walking towards her, and it's just like this dark, eerie.
One of the things I like about that score, which is something I liked about John Carpenter. Again, I'm sorry about beating a dead horse of this, but I really like synth. So to describe what I'm talking about here, and I don't want to assume that people are idiots who are listening, but like a synth pad is basically like the pad is like the kind of like the droning sound, right? So it's like as opposed to like in Halloween, like in the theme when he's playing the melodies that's played just regular like piano, right? It's like just different sounds basically. And I really like that kind of like, because in the Terminator score, there's like this layer of almost like background droning notes and chords. And then there's that boom, like stuff on top of that. And it creates this really interesting layered effect that it would be hard to do that in an orchestra, because even though you could have, for instance, a violin playing like a, there are breaks in the notes. Like it's not like this. It doesn't create the same sense of like almost like if you think of Sicario and that like like when they're like in Juarez or.
I like that. That's a really good score, actually, too.
Well, we're going to mention that
doing
for
the
sure.
but not to get too far off topic. And
Oh no, Hans Zimmer is coming. We're going to talk about that. But actually, before we go to Hans
It's like in
Zimmer,
every trailer now.
someone that Logan I think wants to talk to us about, and who, speaking of people who were in bands, Cliff Martinez is from New York City. He's a drummer. He played for Captain Beefheart. Was the drummer for the Red Hot Chili Peppers from 83 to 86, was on their first 2 records. And then he did his first music for movies/TV. I didn't know this. I found this out today for the Pee Wee Herman show.
Oh yeah.
In the 80s.
Yep.
But then he started, like, in seriousness, started doing film scores in the 90s. Steven Soderbergh. He did Sex, Lies, and Videotapes, Schizopolis, King of the Hill, Kafka, The Limey, which Logan was talking about, Traffic, and then he's also really well known for the stuff he's done with Nicholas Winding Refn. Is that how you say his name? He's a Danish filmmaker who did Drive, Neon Demon, Only God Forgives, Pusher Trilogy, Valhalla Rising, all these movies. So if you want to...
Yeah, I wanted to talk about sort of everyone, when we're talking about, I guess, Nicholas Winding Refn and at least more of the soundtracks of his films, a lot of people always put Drive on the sort of #1 list, but I feel that Drive it's more of a compilation of music, like with the opening, sort of the driving, his first driving scene. We have that.
That's Chromatics. They did that.
Exactly, but I'm saying the soundtrack is more of a sort of compilation.
It's like a combo of like score and soundtrack.
And I remember more of the sort of real human being, and those songs from the movie as opposed to sort of the Cliff Martinez.
That's not him either. That's a different band.
That's not.
Yeah, that's the point he's making.
I'm agreeing with the guy.
But you're interrupting.
So the point is, apparently he was the composer on that film, but he didn't compose. I don't remember the compositions. Whereas I remember sort of Only God Forgives, which I remember more than Neon Demon, but I feel his presence is more felt, especially in Only God Forgives, and sort of creating the world for that film, but definitely the Neon Demon. And his sort of synthy type, speaking more of synths in a modern day context of, I guess I'm just talking more about Nicholas Winding Refn's films.
Yeah, I have a weird relationship with Refn because the first movies of his I saw are the Pusher trilogy. I don't know if you guys have seen these movies.
I haven't, but I know.
I loved those movies, and I saw those years and years ago, probably like 10, 15 years ago. And so if you're listening and you don't know what these are, he made these 3 low-budget movies about drug dealers in Copenhagen. He's from Denmark, and they kind of overlap. So there's what's that guy's name? Mads Mikkelsen. He's the villain in Casino Royale, a James Bond film.
He's Hannibal.
He's Hannibal. I forgot about that. Yeah, in the TV show. So he plays like a minor character in the first one, and then the primary character in the second one. And it's kind of like it's just these overlapping, but they're very low budget, Scorsese-esque, like almost realist films. And I loved those. And then I saw Bronson, which I hated.
Pointless movie.
I can appreciate Tom Hardy's performance in it. I didn't get what the point
of
the film.
There's no point. There's absolutely no point. There's no point.
And Valhalla Rising, I was like on the fence about, and Drive I liked, but like I didn't like. People lost their minds for Drive, and I was like, I liked it, but I wasn't like.
Then on the offhand, they hated Only God Forgives, and I loved.
Yeah, see, I haven't seen that though. I haven't seen that, but
everyone hates it though. Everyone, and even more so than that movie, they hate the Neon Demon.
Yeah, people hate that too.
Which is one thing you mentioned that Cliff Martinez is. They put Drive as the #1 score for him. Yeah. That might have something to do with the fact that they like Drive so much. I've seen the Neon Demon and Only God Forgives. I haven't seen the Neon Demon, although I've been listening to the score lately, and it's really good.
I was listening to Only God Forgives score today, and it's amazing.
Yeah, Only God Forgives, the movie was horrible. I hated that.
I don't hate it. I like it.
So Stranger Things.
You'll probably hate the Neon Demon.
I'm not going to watch it.
If you go to YouTube and type in Only God Forgives Cliff Martinez, first track that comes up, Stranger Things just straight up ripped it off. Like it's an arpeggio and it's the exact same notes. It's
theme.
Exactly the same.
Okay.
It's not the opening theme for Stranger Things. It's the music they play.
I know what you're talking about. If it sounds like kind of like Want to Fight.
When shit starts to get real. Yeah.
They might have just
that thing. Yeah.
They literally might have just asked him, "Can we rip it?"
And he's like,
"Yeah." And they might credit him. I don't know. I'd have to check.
Yeah, it's like exactly the same. And of course, people on YouTube were enraged about one another because of it. music.
He's definitely talented though, because like a lot of his stuff.
But he did Traffic, and Traffic to me is one of those movies where like I saw that when I think I was like 17.
Yeah, it's been a while.
And I had no precedent for that movie, and it like blew me away. Like the way that Soderbergh directs it, the way that the structure is set up, the music, like it's all just was so unexpected to me, and I loved his work in that. And then the one other thing I wanted to mention of Cliff Martinez before we move on was Mike and I just watched Game Night. Have you seen that?
I didn't see Game Night, but I saw the trailer.
You know that like really like ominous synth music that comes out of nowhere. So if you don't know, Game Night is basically like a black comedy about these people who are playing a game wherein one of them gets fake kidnapped and then they have to find them, but then the person gets actually kidnapped.
Yeah.
But the music is like, it sounds like that track from Only God Forgives. That one theme is like this like synth music, and it's so out of place in a way in that movie, but it works so well because of that. So we're talking about synthesizers, modern practitioners of the synth score. One of the person I want to mention, Johan Johansson. He's Icelandic. He was so I read this recently because I was reading about he did the score for Mandy, which was his last score earlier before he passed away. He was a metalhead growing up, so when he met the director of Mandy, and they weren't sure if they would get along, the director of Mandy was talking about, I don't know, some metal band, and Johan Johansson was like, "Oh yeah, I love them." So I was reading today that Johan Johansson was in a band called Daisy Hill Puppy Farm, which was a proto shoegaze album or band that John Peel loved. Played them on the BBC, and Steve Albini, who is famous for having recorded tons of great post-rock records, Godspeed You Black Emperor, Mono, but probably most famous for having done In Utero by Nirvana. He loved it and wrote a fan letter to this guy, who ended up becoming a film composer he's very famous for having worked with Denis Villeneuve, right? Prisoners, Sicario, Arrival. He was nominated for an Oscar for Theory of Everything. Did he win? I don't know if he won.
I don't think he won an Oscar. He did new Blade Runner 2049.
No, well, so he was writing the music for that.
I thought you meant Dennis.
Yeah, the director did. Yeah. So and this guy was originally going to do the music for this, but when he submitted it, the studio and the director felt that it wasn't similar enough to the original score, and they thought fans would really want like that same kind of music.
That's so good.
I've been listening to the Mandy score a ton recently, and I almost feel like I like the score more than the movie. Like I love it. I can't stop playing. I played like 5 times in a row the other day when I was at work. And it works really well as these almost like abstract mood pieces where you don't need to see the movie to like the music.
There's a lot of movies like that.
But I feel like that's one of the few nowadays that you can sort of listen to on its own. But a lot of movies, like, you cannot listen to the soundtrack by itself because it's just not that compelling or that great on its own.
Yeah, because sometimes when I'm writing or just sitting at work and I'm not doing anything that requires me to like think too hard and I can listen to music, I can put on like the Blade Runner score or... lately, when I want to listen to synths, I will listen to like something from like the Neon Demon or some other stuff like that. Or if I want to do classical music, I'll listen to some Bernard Herrmann or Philip Glass, and we'll talk about those guys later. But like for example, I really liked the music in Mad Max Fury Road, but I'm not going to sit here and listen to the score for it.
It's just going to be like,
and I'm like, I like it, but I don't need to listen to it.
It's like getting
right?
kicked in the face.
Yeah, just for I can have.
Although I've heard you listening to the Sicario.
I do like that
score before.
Yeah, I like that.
And one other score of this nature I want to mention just quickly, and then we'll move on. Is I love the score for Gravity, which is Stephen Price.
Yeah. Can't remember it well, but I know at the time.
It's interesting. I loved it when I saw the movie, and I don't often listen to scores other than seeing them in the movie.
Yeah.
But I was looking for some kind of like abstract sort of like Stars with a Lid style stuff to put on at work a couple weeks ago, and I went to the Gravity score and I listened to it over and over again. It's really good, and it like there are bits of it that I think are kind of like the music Logan's talking about, where like it's so fragmented that it doesn't work without the visuals. But there are a handful of pieces in that score that really stand on their own and work well as like ambient music.
Yeah, I think also. I mean, I remember, like I said, I remember liking the score when I saw the movie, but I haven't gone back to it. And that might have something to do with the movie itself, which I thought was fine, but I wasn't like a huge, just like, it wasn't that great of a movie to me because I felt like half of it could be cut out and you'd still have the same kind of movie. And so, when I really like a movie and the music and everything connects, I'll go back later and I'll find the soundtracks. It's so easy to find now and listen to it. But like if a film doesn't really strike a chord with me, I may completely forget about it. And then like we're mentioning now and I'm like, yeah, I think I liked it. I just can't remember anything of it.
Have you seen Attack the Block? Have you seen this movie?
A while back.
Yeah, so the same guy who did Gravity did the score for Attack the Block, which I also really liked, which is very synthy. But he's also done stuff like he did Suicide Squad, which I haven't seen, but I was listening to some of it today, and it's not like really.
You don't need to see it.
It's not. Yeah, I've heard it's not very good, but it's not the same.
And the sequel's coming out as well.
Same type of music. It's interesting.
Like $800 million. So of course there are sequels coming out.
So someone who we can't not mention, and who I think is really interesting because he combines like electro synthy stuff with traditional like mega orchestral stuff, is Hans Zimmer.
Yeah.
And Hans Zimmer, interestingly, is extremely popular with like the EDM crowd. And I think it's because, this is just me shooting my mouth off. I have no proof of this, but I think it's because the way that he orchestrates slow build from like a small melody into this massive crescendo and explosion is similar to the way that EDM goes like builds up to the bass drop and then creates this sense of like euphoria and insanity.
Especially in the 2010s, starting with Inception and now with Dunkirk. Did he do Dunkirk score for that?
So he's
pretty much Nolan just calls him up.
He made.
I just have in
Hans,
my notes.
I got another movie.
Nolan. So I actually saw Hans Zimmer speak at one point, and he said that when he did the score for Interstellar, Christopher Nolan came to his house and was like, I want you to think about the end of human civilization. And then he just left. Hans Zimmer was like, what the fuck?
Well, I read what's interesting is... what's
God damn it, Chris! God damn it, Chris!
With them, I heard is that Nolan will tell him what he wants, and then Zimmer will record it before they film anything. Which is, I think,
that's interesting,
not the way they normally do that stuff.
Yeah, they did
And he
that
plays
with,
it on set, or does he not play it on set?
I don't think he plays on set like Leone did, but like here's some of the films that he did. I just pulled him up because I remember I looked him up a long time ago because I'm like, he worked with Nolan a lot, and then I was like, what? He's like,
dude, it's insane.
He's
Gladiator.
like,
so he did just
Rain
films
Man?
that people know: Rain Man, Twister, Black Rain, Driving Miss Daisy, Bird on a Wire,
Black
Days of
Rain,
Thunder,
that's a
Pacific
fancy
Heights,
score.
Green Card,
That's insane.
Backdraft, Thelma and Louise. He did K2,
The
A
Rock.
League of Their Own,
A lot of Ridley Scott movies.
True Romance, Cool Runnings, Renaissance
Cool
Man,
Runnings.
The Lion King,
He did The
Crimson
Lion King? That's so
Tide,
random.
Broken Arrow, which we watched not too long
Yeah,
ago,
did
The
John
Rock,
Woo.
The Fan, The Preacher's Wife, The Peacemaker, As Good as It Gets, The Prince of Egypt, The Thin Red Line,
Last Samurai. Did
Mission
he do
Impossible
that?
2, and that's all before getting into the years 2000 when he starts
it's
working with
insane.
Nolan. He's a,
12 years. He did
What was
12
his
Years a
first
Slave.
Nolan?
his first
He did the Batman movies.
Tim Burton.
film that I see here is 84's Success
Wait, no.
is the Best
No, he did
Revenge.
Nolan's
Oh, yeah,
Batman.
you're right. I was like,
Success is the Best Revenge in
1984, right?
So
Yeah.
he's been around for what, 35 years,
34
34 years?
yeah.
But like that list of credits is
just nuts.
mind-boggling.
Well, and so do we have anything else to say about him? Because I have another person who's kind of
he's a
similar.
beast.
Oh, and he also is in. Fun fact: he's in the video for "Video Killed the Radio Star" because he worked with that group
interesting.
before becoming a film composer.
Awesome.
Danny Elfman, who we talked about,
Yeah.
who is, I guess, kind of a contemporary of Hans Zimmer. I think a lot of people know Danny Elfman from working with Tim Burton. Pee Wee Herman, Beetlejuice, Batman, Edward Scissorhands, Batman Returns, Nightmare Before Christmas, Mars Attacks. I mean, it's basically every Tim Burton movie. Sleepy Hollow, Corpse Bride, Charlie and Chocolate Factory, Planet of the Apes, Big Fish, Alice in Wonderland.
Basically,
Well,
yeah. They work
but
together.
he also, and he's done like the kind of like he did Men in Black, and I think you would expect that, having seen that he did the Tim Burton stuff. He did The Dark Man, Dick Tracy, Nightbreed, Army
Those all
of Darkness. He does a
fit.
lot of Sam Raimi stuff.
Yeah.
And he was actually the main. He was the lead vocalist, and lead songwriter in Oingo Boingo. Fun fact for you, the band. But he does like mainstream, like he did To Die For. He did Good Will Hunting. He did Dead Presidents. He did American Hustle.
He did Dead Presidents?
Yeah, he did Mission Impossible. He did The Kingdom, the Peter Bird
He
movie.
did Simpsons, obviously.
He did the Simpsons theme. So like, I mean, he did Hellboy 2. He did Milk.
he could have retired from the Simpsons theme, but he likes to.
But I mean, I think it's like he is a giant of like modern film composition, and we would be remiss not to mention it. But I really like the stuff he does with Tim Burton in particular. I mean, like the Tim Burton Batman movie, I was 6 when that came out.
It's awesome.
And
awesome score.
Fucking love that movie. And just the music is just so evocative of... That was like the first time that I can remember paying attention to the music in a movie was that movie. Well, so if we want to move to Italy...
Let's do it.
Because we know that Mike is a big Morricone fan, because Mike is a huge Sergio Leone fan.
A big fan.
Morricone, I was reading this guy's stats today. It is mind-blowing. This dude recorded he composed more than 500 film scores.
Pretty much any Italian
And in
maker,
addition to
filmmaker at the
that,
time.
he has written 100 pieces of classical music. He was born in 1928. He started working in the 50s. He's in his 7th decade of making movie music.
He still goes on tour, and not outside of his country anymore, where he does like live performances, and he's a maestro, and he does all the.
But I mean, it's just like,
stuff,
he composed what is probably the most famous piece of film music of all time, outside of probably the Star Wars theme, which is the.
Wow.
It's up there, or Ecstasy of Gold, which, even if you don't know who he is or any of those Italian movies, you know that song because it's in like so many commercials. It's the scene at the end where Tuco falls into the grave.
This is Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Yeah,
if you
the
don't
bad
know.
ugly.
Yeah.
Spoiler: he falls into the graveyard and he starts running around, and he starts running around. It's that music playing. And it's like the Ecstasy of Gold. And it's supposed to be like.
No, it's like that. I can't do it. It's like
we'll play it for you then. We'll drop a piece of it in.
You've heard it. They used it in the theme, the opening theme of Jackass 2.
Wah wah. Oh, here we go. Wah wah.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. That's exactly it. Yeah.
And then when they have the shootout, then there's another really good piece of music, and it's like, and then he
did Fistful of Dollars for a few
some-
dollars more. Good, Bad, and the Ugly. Once Upon a Time in the West. Once Upon a Time in America.
Once Upon a
My
Time in the
favorite.
West has some really good music in it as well, especially with the harmonica. And one of the main characters' name is harmonica because he plays it.
Yeah.
And
My
there's some
favorite
really
is
good-
Duck You Sucker because they use a bassoon and it's so fantastic in that movie. And that's my favorite Leone film as well is Duck You Sucker.
So-
Giu La Testa in Italian.
So when we talked about these composers who had to like put all the music together for every instrument in these groups, he's one of those guys that
Like he worked with huge
yeah.
orchestras. Yeah.
So
he did La Ventura, which is an extremely famous film. The score for that. He worked with Bernardo Bertolucci 5 times. Bertolucci did Last Tango in Paris, The Conformist, The Last Emperor, didn't he?
yes.
I literally pulled up his thing to see if I could give you a rundown, but it's just like the page
No,
just
it's
goes
insane.
on and on. And I'm not
He
even
did
trying.
Massacre in Rome, which is not like a particularly noteworthy movie, other than it was interesting to me as a side note because Logan was telling me earlier this week that George P. Cosmatos, or Cosmatos, I don't speak Greek, who directed that film is the father of the guy who did Mandy.
So
That is correct.
to say how big of a fan I am of him and his music, he's done the score for 3 of my top 5 favorite films of all time.
Well, list them for us.
The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Once Upon a Time in the West, and The Thing. Even though
that
him and The
sweeping
Thing.
theme and
because Carpenter did do some music for The Thing, right? They
Carpenter
both
did some and
contributed
Morricone
stuff, yeah.
did some. So those are 3 of probably my top 5 films
And
of all
I have
time.
to say, so this is a divisive movie, and I don't want to have a debate about it right now, The Hateful Eight, but I loved his music in The Hateful Eight. It's so ominous.
Is it a rehash of The Thing, though? It's very similar.
It's very
to The Thing.
similar, yeah.
And the movie itself is very similar to The Thing as well, if you want to look at it
because
that
The
way.
Thing's so good.
Yeah, well, and Tarantino will
They can
talk
make,
about
like,
how he
20
was...
more things.
Like, basically, Tarantino was... Well, from what I've read, he was like, I was watching The Thing, and I was reading, like, Agatha Christie. And that's basically what this movie is. It's like, a crime happens, these people are trapped, it's snowing, and they have to figure out... Like,
Right, but I mean, and the music is similar, too.
Yeah, I
to
mean,
The Thing as well.
Tarantino makes no, like... He's a big Leone fan as well.
Oh, yeah.
And
he's used, I mean, Inglourious Bastards has Morricone music in
and
it,
so
Django
obviously-
Unchained has
Oh,
Morricone
Once Upon a Time in
music.
America, we gotta talk about that score.
I
Oh,
feel
man.
like if you're a Leone fan, you have to almost be a Morricone fan. So of course Tarantino is a big fan of his and I want to use his music.
Well, and do you
or
think
music sounds the same.
that no? I mean, it's so like Leone is like so obviously the precursor to Tarantino.
Yeah.
I feel that they're like it's like father and son almost,
Yeah.
if you want to call it like that, in terms of their style and the films they make.
Actually, their personalities are probably pretty similar too. Both kind of assholes.
You should listen to the score for Once Upon a Time in America. That's like epic, sweeping, gigantic.
Well, so is Once
That's the
Upon a
film he
Time in
always
Hollywood
wanted to
going to
make.
have Morricone music
I
in
would
it?
imagine so.
It must, right?
No, well, not necessarily. I think it's going to be more of the music of the time. Probably.
So it's funny because Leone.
Well, yeah, I mean, Tarantino
is
always
interesting
uses pop music.
with when he made the trilogy and he always got Clint Eastwood in it. He offered Charles Bronson the role in the second and third movie, but Charles Bronson was busy and turned him down. And they got into him and Clint Eastwood got into a spat after a while, and they didn't want to work together anymore. And so when he made Once Upon a Time in the West, he said it's good to finally work with the real actor because he finally got Charles Bronson.
Brutal.
And he got Henry Fonda to play against Type play.
Yeah,
bad
well,
guy.
I mean,
I thought Clint Eastwood
yeah.
just didn't want to do Once Upon a Time in the West because he's like done 3 of those movies.
He's done
and he
3,
wanted
but
to go
also
back
they
to-
they clashed, and he didn't want to be away and stuff. There's a lot of stuff that goes.
Well, and
into
Clint Eastwood,
but it's
like,
just
he
funny
hates
'cause-
taking a long time to make movies, too.
And it's just like, it's funny because he's like, finally got to work with the real actor. And I read the film he always wanted to make was Once Upon a Time in America, and the actor he always wanted to work with was Robert De Niro. And he finally got to do that. And
I just watched the 4-hour version of that not that long ago. It's a beastly fucking movie.
It's a beast of a movie. It's
Opium,
it's
opium,
not-
it's all in a pipe dream.
It's a good movie, but I think
He's just high the whole time.
I would say it's maybe my 4th or 5th favorite.
Yeah,
Leone
it's not.
film.
I mean, it's the good, the bad.
The music's
so,
awesome.
The
You gotta-
good, the
you
bad,
gotta
and the
admit the
ugly.
music is awesome.
So good.
I had the
my
advantage.
favorite film of all time.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me to be like, there are certain films that I've seen, very famous films that I've seen kind of late in life that I'm glad that I saw late in life because I was able to appreciate what they were doing.
Yeah.
And that movie is we watched that when, like 2-3 years ago.
Maybe sooner.
So I was like in my early 30s when
Yeah.
I saw that movie, and it like blew my mind. And I think if I had seen that when I was like in high school or something, I would have enjoyed it, but I wouldn't have had an understanding of the magnitude.
It would have
what
been
was-
an action film to you versus like it's basically an epic
It's-
in the
I
same
think-
as
I think the
like
first time I
Once
saw that
Upon a
was
Time.
2008 because that's when I first got into not to drive too far away from our conversation, but I think I got into that film after seeing Yojimbo, and I may have seen for A Fistful of Dollars after that, or vice versa.
See, I did
Yeah, I
see
think
that
I
film
saw
when I was a kid.
Yojimbo and Fistful of Dollars like at the exact same time. Like I saw Yojimbo, and then like a couple weeks later, I saw Fistful of Dollars.
I did see that movie as a kid, and then I've seen it probably.
Did you see it in Russian? Or was
No. I saw it here, but I was young.
Is there a Soviet version?
I would guess they just dub it because it's real easy since it's all dubbed anyway.
Yeah, that's
he
true,
doesn't
yeah.
It's funny. With speaking of composers, Leone doesn't record audio on film.
yeah, and
so
that's
what he
an
does
Italian
is he
thing.
plays the
Yeah.
music.
Yeah.
he plays Morricone's music
So,
in the.
This is actually
right to
the
it.
perfect lead into our next
yeah.
Nino Rota, who worked a lot with Fellini. I'm a huge Fellini fan. Fellini also did not record
lot of
the
the
sound
time
on set. Yeah, and
Directors did.
so Nino Rota did with Fellini. He did La Strada, La Dolce Vita, 8.5, Amarcord. He did Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. He did the first 2 Godfather films. And he was. This is something that's really interesting to me. Is that he also did Juliet of the Spirits, which is a Fellini film. He was really into quotations from so if you listen to, for instance, the score for La Dolce Vita or 8.5, there's like snippets of like Dvorak and Beethoven, but they're interwoven with like this crazy circus music that Fellini loved. And Nino Rota very frequently would like take quotations from really famous music pieces and like sprinkle them into his own things and kind of like warp them around to like get you in the zone of here's something familiar, but we're going to go this weird direction with it.
Did he do La Strada as well? Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm
Did you
not.
say that? I feel like
I have it written here. I
I'm
don't know
not
if
too
that-
familiar with a lot of Fellini stuff. My bad. But
That's not really your cup of tea, I
No,
don't think.
but,
Can you imagine Mike watching La Dolce Vita
just
3
jamming
hours?
out. But Godfather, I do remember the music very well, and it's funny because my mom really likes that music, even though she can't watch the film. She's violent and all that stuff.
Oh, she doesn't like violence?
because the music's very beautiful, and it's like so you can. It's like one of those cases where you can appreciate the music even if you don't want to watch the film. And she's not saying the film's bad. It's obviously not bad. It's just like. It's very violent, even for a movie from '72. People are getting murdered and shit like that, and some people just don't want to see it. But the music itself is beautiful.
That should be, there should be a new Godfather poster that says on it, "People are getting murdered and shit." Mike Sitnikov. That's the review that's on there.
That would sell tickets, though. People would be like, I want to see some people get murdered and shit. I'm going to go see this movie.
In 2018?
Pre-order.
You know, the sad thing is, I bet you if you ask a lot of people who were born in this millennium, so 2000 on, if they've seen Godfather and know about it, no, hell no.
Hell no.
There's no way.
No one gives two shits about the past nowadays.
No.
There's two other things I want to mention really quickly, European art films, and then we'll move away from Europe. I love the 400 Blows, and I love the music in that movie, and that was John Constantine.
Was that the first Fellini? I mean, not Fellini.
It's the first Truffaut film, yeah. I couldn't find fucking anything about that guy who wrote the music for that. He only did like a couple other movies, and he just kind of like, he's very enigmatic.
Disappeared?
So, and then I think we would be remiss not to mention this person, even though I don't think any of us are huge Swedish film fans, but Bergman, obviously you can't talk about movies without talking about Bergman. Eric Nordgren did basically all the major Bergman movies: Seven Seal, Wild Strawberries, Smiles, Summer Night, Virgin Spring, and I love the Seven Seal, and the music for that movie is amazing. So just to put that out there. So
it's the first Criterion movie I bought, by the way.
Is it?
Yeah.
Very nice.
I think mine was Stray Dog, Kurosawa movie.
Was it?
Yeah. Traveling to the Other Side of the World, someone that Logan really wants to talk about.
Yeah, he's itching. He's just getting ready.
He's so excited. His leg is going up and down. He's taking his pants off.
Boy.
Joe Hisaishi. So I'll let you talk about this guy. The one thing I do want to say that I found really interesting is that his name is Mamoru Fujisawa. That's his birth name.
Oh, okay.
And he adopted the name Joe Hisaishi. But he's scored more than 100 movies, and I'll let Logan talk about what they are.
What I really wanted to talk about was sort of just as a composer who kind of has done so much work. I wanted to sort of compare him, or just talk about him in comparison to like an American composer like John Williams, where we everyone knows who John Williams is because we know John Williams' sort of the themes that he does.
Let's list some of them. Just Star Wars,
Indiana Jones,
a lot of Spielberg stuff.
Indiana Jones,
Harry Potter,
Jurassic Park, Harry Potter.
Any Spielberg thing, really.
Every major, except for Lord of the Rings and maybe The Matrix, he did like every major sci-fi.
Schindler's List with Spielberg?
He did Schindler's List,
okay.
and that music is beautiful.
Right.
Has to be. Couldn't be like a very exciting Jurassic Park theme.
John Carpenter did the score for Schindler's List.
I printed out the discography here. He did a bunch of stuff. Look, his discography goes back to 1957.
Who are we talking about?
John Williams. But I'm just saying,
he's old
in comparison to Joe Hisaishi, who probably, if you know who John Williams is, you don't know who Hisaishi is. I just wanted to compare sort of, we know themes from sort of John Williams, but Hisaishi, his scores as a whole, I think you can listen to any one, and I just marked some off here. Nazca of the Valley of the Wind, Arion, it's a fantastic movie from 1985. And these are all anime, by the way. I love anime. I'm a huge anime fan and love collecting Japanese anime soundtracks. But Lapta, Castle in the Sky. He did Robot Carnival. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think he did all but one Miyazaki movie, right?
Yeah. Robot Carnival is like this collection of all these different Japanese directors did like these little short films that involve robots.
Oh, yeah, that was the first anime I ever saw, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when I was in middle school.
Okay, so like My Neighbor Totoro, Venus Wars, awesome, just awesome.
So did he do? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the Totoro, like does he write those little theme songs too, like the jingles, or is he just writing the score?
I'm not sure. I don't see why he wouldn't though. You know,
yeah, I mean it makes sense. Yeah,
I mean, but because I don't think Miyazaki was doing.
Totoro. I can't. Whenever I hear that song, it's in my head for like weeks. I can't get it out of my head.
But yeah, Kiki's Delivery Service.
I love that movie.
Scene at the Sea. If you haven't seen that, that's a synth soundtrack right there. We're going back to talking about synths in this podcast, but there's like a very like. If you want to do maybe like just a sample, just to give them a taste, like there's like this like heavy like driving scene because it's about this surf competition that happens in Japan and everyone's at the beach. Or is it that's a live action movie. Yeah. But Hisaishi has done like all of Miyazaki's film, like I was saying. But Oh,
he
and
did some Takeshi. Is
yes.
that a Takeshi Kitano movie? Seen by the City?
Yes, it is.
And he did like,
all of those scores
Sonatine,
as well.
Fireworks, like all that stuff. Yeah.
Tanabe, and a video game soundtrack, by the way, Parasite Eve. If you guys have heard of that,
that one,
soundtrack.
Mike's more of a gamer.
Parasite Eve. It's
it's
more of an RPG.
But what I know more about the game than the game itself is that the main character was hot.
Yeah, and she has blonde hair.
And she's in some...
And, you might actually like it. Well,
no, she's not.
Yes, she is.
No,
Wait,
she's
what?
not. She's in hentai.
Hentai.
But the main character?
Yeah.
That's what the game is about? Oh.
No. The game's not about that. I'm
People
just
have
saying,
lifted the main character and put her in hentai. That's horrible.
Of course it's horrible, but it's horribly entertaining.
But anyway, I just wanted to talk about Hisaishi's scores as a whole. They're just fantastic. If I compel everyone on here who's listening to listen to the soundtrack to Venus Wars. It is one of the best soundtracks I've heard in my life. I just think it's fantastic.
And one of my friends at work is a huge Joe Hisaishi fan, and she orders like they did for 25 years of Studio Ghibli. If you're unfamiliar with anime or Japanese like cinema in general, Studio Ghibli is Hayao Miyazaki's studio, and Hayao Miyazaki is directed like most of the anime films that I would say the average American who knows nothing about anime has heard of, like Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke.
There's another argument. Do you think Miyazaki's films are anime or are they not? But anyway, I think they're animation. But that's
technically they are, because anime is the short form of the Japanese word for animation, which is animation. So technically,
okay.
But so Studio Ghibli did like a big concert for the 25th anniversary of the studio.
Oh, man.
And they recorded it as a Blu-ray. And so this coworker I have who loves Joe Hisaishi, she ordered that from Japan. She has like a version of it, like a digital version of it at work. She just plays all day in the background.
Mm-hmm.
People who love this guy love this guy.
Mm-hmm. And as for good reason.
I know. And if you're comparing him to John Williams, we have to mention John Williams. Should we talk anymore? But I mean, everyone knows like
that's why I don't know if we need to. I don't know if we need to go in there anymore.
Look at this discography. This goes back to 1957.
Williams?
This is 10 pages.
Read us some greatest hits.
I don't think people realize how old this guy and how long he's been working.
I mean, where should we start? Should we start at what's the first? Fiddler on the Roof. Okay, I'll start in the 70s.
Okay.
Images, Tom Sawyer. I'm looking for something that we know. Towering Inferno. Okay, there we go.
The Rush song.
Jaws. Okay, starting with Jaws. Look at that. 1975 Jaws. Star Wars 77 ends. Okay, I mean.
Done.
The Close Encounters.
He's like, I'm retired. I got my $1 billion.
Jaws 2. I mean, Superman. Dracula. 1941. Star Wars. Any Spielberg movie, obviously.
Yeah, Superman is a song I always sing for if you watch our YouTube channel, when we do the vinyl unboxings, for not on purpose. When I open the record box, that song comes
I actually
into my
edited
mind,
one where I put the theme in there for the sumac.
Yeah, it's the Christopher Reeve Superman. Yeah,
so
the river.
I didn't know that was John Williams.
Very, very prolific composer.
And he's,
Empire of the Sun. Okay, another Spielberg.
I was thinking,
Spielberg, geez. I mean,
so Logan was mentioning how Joe Hisaishi has these very consistent works that hold together as like entire scores, and John Williams is really well known for his themes. And I was trying to think of like some kind of analogy that I could make for this, and it's almost like a band like the Beatles who write just these amazing catchy songs, but the albums are not these like conceptual works with through lines to them, versus like a Led Zeppelin or a Pink Floyd, or like you don't find yourself like humming the melody like randomly off the top of your head, but you sit down and listen to it. It's just phenomenal work of music. So there's two other Japanese composers that I want to mention before we leave Japan, because I am a huge fan of Japanese cinema, and I studied in undergrad. I studied a lot of Japanese stuff. I lived in Tokyo for a while. Toru Takemitsu.
Double Suicide.
So yeah, he did Double Suicide. So he was a composer. Most of his stuff was composed outside of film scoring. He did a handful of film scores, but he was more of like an avant-garde composer. He was largely self-taught, and he was very kind of like experimental. And one of the things that he was known for and was an expert in was manipulating instruments so that you could change like the pitch and the timbre of them, so that you would play a violin, it doesn't sound like a violin. So he would get these really otherworldly sounds, and he would do experiments with like recording stuff and then manipulating the tape so it would sound weird. And he was a writer. And he wrote about aesthetics and music theory. And he did both orchestral and electronic music, so it kind of bridges the gap. But so he did the scores for Harakiri and Kwaidan, which are both Masaki Kobayashi films.
Yep. Yes, he did.
And those scores are phenomenal. Like the Kwaidan music, I've downloaded. I have it on my computer. I listen to it all the time, and it's so weird because it has echo. So Kwaidan is like
the opening title sequence with the paint and the what is it? The paint dripping into the water. Or what?
Yeah, so Kwaidan is if you haven't seen it, it's a kind of like horror ghost movie based on this old compilation of Japanese folktales and ghost stories. So they took 4 of them and they made this like 3-hour movie that's basically like 4 kind of short films.
And actually, just a little side note, it was supposed to be different Japanese directors directing, but something didn't fall through. And the director, whose name slips me because Kwaidan is one of my favorite movies, in addition to The Human Condition, which did
same guy,
Takemitsu?
Masaki Kobayashi.
Yeah, Masaki Kobayashi. There we go. Anyway,
and Masaki Kobayashi is like one of these. He's not like this towering figure like Kurosawa or Ozu, but is one of the great Japanese filmmakers. Yeah. And so The Human Condition is this like 9.5-hour film about the Japanese experience during World War II. He also did a really great movie about that. I'm not gonna remember the name. Harakiri is like if you're only ever gonna watch, I would say, as a huge fan of Japanese cinema, and I'm a huge fan of Kurosawa, but if you're only ever gonna watch one Chambara is like Japanese sword fighting films in your life, I would say see Harakiri.
And Tetsuya Nakada. So what's double?
Tatsuya
plus?
Nakada is amazing.
What was the other?
Logan and I actually saw Tatsuya Nakada speak. So this guy is like in his 80s. Like he was in Seven Samurai. Like that's how long this guy's been around for. And like 3 years ago, Logan and I got to see him speak, and it was amazing. And he talked about, he's not allowed to talk about this in Japan because it's illegal there. Yeah. But he talked about how in Harakiri they used real samurai swords for the sword fighting. Yeah.
Whoops.
And then Toru Takemitsu did the score for Ran, which is this really brooding, beautiful orchestral music. Ran is Kurosawa's adaptation of King Lear, if you haven't seen it. And then I briefly just want to mention Masaru Sato, who was... So Masaru Sato was the like protege, mentee, or whatever you want to call it, of Fumio Hayasaka, who was a close friend of Kurosawa's and did all of Kurosawa's music up until 1955, and then he died. And then Masaru Sato took over, and he did Yojimbo, which is like this really great music that's almost like kind of like James Bondy. Throne of Blood, which is like traditional Japanese no music, so ominous. Hidden Fortress, Bad Sleep Well, Sandro, High and Low, Redbeard, like all that shit. And then he worked with Ishiro Honda, who was the director of Godzilla. Did a bunch of stuff. So his music is great. Check it out, Masaru Sato. Before we get to one,
he's flying through his notes, ladies and gentlemen.
But I don't want this podcast to be 9 hours long. But so I'm a huge fan of Hong Kong movies, kung fu movies, Shaw Brothers, and stuff like that. And for the most part, I don't find like a lot of scores for Hong Kong movies. I wouldn't sit down and listen to them. Like they work for the movie, but they don't stand out to me. But some Shaw Brothers movies, and if you don't know, Shaw Brothers is a studio that did tons and tons and tons and tons of kung fu movies. Among other stuff, they did horror movies, they did erotic films, they did like all kinds of stuff. And
I knows about that.
So I was looking up, like, I was like, who did the music for Shaw Brothers movies? Because I've never heard the name of a Shaw Brothers composer or anything. I found these 2 people. So, and if you're familiar with Shaw Brothers movies, you already know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But if you're not, so there's someone named Chen Young-yu, who has 222 credits as a composer. And let me just read you. So if you know Shaw Brothers movies, let me just read this. These are all scores composed by the same person. 36 Chambers of the Shaolin, The New One-Armed Swordsman, Five Fingers of Death, Sugar Daddies, which is one of their erotic films, Inframan, Black Magic, Shaolin Temple, Killer Clans, Black Magic 2, The Brave Archer, The Sentimental Swordsman, Executioners from Shaolin, Lady Executioner, Avenging Eagle, which is my probably favorite Shaw Brothers movie, Magnificent Bodyguards, The Five Deadly Venoms, Heroes from the East, Invincible Shaolin, Crippled Avengers. Like, all these movies are so famous, and the same person did the score for all of them, like legend status. And then the one other person I found from Hong Kong, Frankie Chan, also somewhat enigmatic. Frankie Chan was an actor who has 125 credits as a composer, did Snake Fist Fighter, which is a really early Jackie Chan movie, Warriors 2, The Flying Guillotine, Broken Oath, Spiritual Kung Fu, Enter the Fat Dragon, Magnificent Butcher, Knockabout, and then, funnily enough,
Butcher, that sounds
did
fantastic.
a ton of stuff in the 70s and 80s, disappeared, and then came back under a different name working for Wong Kar-wai. And did Chungking Express, Ashes of Time,
completely
Fallen
different
Angels.
sound too, right?
Yeah.
Completely different.
He might have just left and
was
found
just
himself,
bored.
worked on his
like,
style.
You travel the world a little bit. Oh, okay.
And he's like, I'm ready to come back.
So I'm as a huge fan of Hong
See,
Kong
he had
cinema.
times. Was he rich? Was he rich? In,
I don't know.
I'm just saying because this goes back to my thing. I'm getting off topic again, but like you get so much money sometimes. Well, maybe you don't. I don't know where I'm going with this, but maybe he was just bored, right? Like I'm bored, but then I want to come back and make more music.
They just called up Wong Kar-wai.
I don't know what else to
do you
do with
got?
my life. You know?
Yeah.
Could be.
Okay, so I've plowed through all this stuff, and now we have the responsibility of mentioning these people who are just like all-time classic, undeniable, greatest film composers of all time. Bernard Herrmann.
Love a lot of his work. Favorite of his work would be North by Northwest, which is actually my favorite Hitchcock film. Not Psycho, not Vertigo, not Rear
Well, and
Window.
he
It's
also
North by
did Psycho,
Northwest.
and he also did Vertigo.
He did. He worked with Hitchcock a lot.
He did The Man Who Knew Too Much.
And he also did Taxi Driver with Scorsese, which is a
Yep.
very.
Fantastic.
And we were listening to both of those, and they're very different. Taxi Driver is a very jazzy.
Yeah, a lot of these
bluesy
older
kind of thing.
people we're going to mention were very diverse writers.
And then
yeah.
North by what is like sort of kind of like a John Williams type, where it's like very big, action oriented.
So, if interesting side note on The Man Who Knew Too Much, the original song "Que Sera Sera" he wrote, which is in that movie.
It's just a quick note before we leave him. His music, especially in North by Northwest, is so iconic, and it's how I mentioned earlier that you know exactly what's happening. You know when that theme comes in, you can picture them running around on the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
Or when that music comes in, you can picture him running from the crop duster.
I love Cary Grant.
That movie,
That's Cary Grant, right?
Yeah. So,
or is it Jimmy Stewart? No, Jimmy Stewart's in The Man Who Knew
It's
Too
Cary
Much.
Grant, even remember
Yeah.
saying
He worked with both of them,
James
but-
Mason.
Yeah.
The music really makes you remember some of these scenes.
And Bernard Herrmann, like this is another person who you're just like legend status. Like this dude did Citizen Kane, The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original Cape Fear, The Twilight Zone, War of the Worlds live broadcast with frickin' Orson Welles, The Magnificent Ambersons. I mean, that's insane.
He's up there.
So John Barry wrote the James Bond theme.
Well,
And
that alone.
So you don't have to mention anything else.
That alone.
Did 11 James Bond movies from 63 to 87, including From Russia with Love, which is my favorite James Bond movie. Thunderball, Moonraker, Goldfinger. He did Midnight Cowboy, Lion in the Winter, Game of Death, which is a famous Bruce Lee film. Body Heat, Dances with Wolves.
Just
Um,
these.
God, I hate that movie.
Dances with
Dances with Wolves?
Oh wait, no, I'm thinking of that other terrible movie from the '90s. Last of the Mohicans. Last of the Mohicans.
Oh, you hate that movie?
You're a hater. That's a good movie.
I will find you.
What the one with the what's his name?
Daniel Day-Lewis?
Yeah, that's the one.
That's Last of the Mohicans, yeah.
I
Great
hate
movie.
that movie.
With great music, actually, in that movie.
I didn't like Last of the Mohicans. Sorry.
Howard Shore.
Don't
has
at
to be
me.
mentioned.
Don't at me.
At him.
Everybody at
At
him.
Logan.
So
Leave some comments.
Howard Shore is more recent, but and will always be remembered for having done Lord of the Rings, I think.
Yeah.
But he's done basically every David Cronenberg movie: The Brood, The Fly, Dead Ringers, Naked Lunch, Videodrome, Scanners. He did Silence of the Lambs, Big, Philadelphia.
Great movies. Yeah.
I
Seven,
saw him
The
speak at
Game.
the Beyond Fest not too long ago.
How was it?
For Dead Ringers, yeah.
He did
Just like-
Spotlight, Ed Wood, Gangs of New
So
York,
he's still working.
Doubt,
Yeah.
Hugo, High Fidelity, After Hours, the Scorsese film.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
my favorite Scorsese movie ever.
It's
It's
Yes.
so amazing to me though, because like even like the greatest directors of all time, and you can say whoever you want. I'm just gonna say like Tarantino because everyone knows him. He's done like what 8, 9 movies. These guys have done like 50
It's
fucking
insane.
blockbusters. Like it's. As a composer, you can be in so many big movies, whereas as a director, and
Logan
actor,
has
you
printed
just
John
can't.
Williams' credits, and it's about 35
Yeah,
pages
it's like-
long.
John Williams did JFK, by the way.
Did he?
Of course
I
he
like
did.
that movie a lot.
I love JFK.
Big up
It's
Oliver
fantastic.
Stone, dude.
So,
James Horner has to be mentioned because James Horner composed the highest-selling movie soundtrack of all time. Who knows what that is? Titanic.
My heart will go on.
I thought it
Also,
was
Celine
Chopping
Dion
Mall.
composed
But
that.
he also did one of Mike's favorite movies of all time, Commando.
Hey, love that movie.
48 Hours, Cocoon, Aliens, Willow, Glory,
Aliens a lot,
Braveheart,
too.
Apollo 13, Perfect Storm, Beautiful Mind, Avatar. Like
He's done a lot of films I like quite a bit.
yeah, so James Horner is known as a quote unquote borrower, which means that he would kind of lift themes from famous music and put them in his own. It is what it is. I mean,
worked.
Nino Rota did that too, and it worked for him. So,
yeah. Maybe I should.
Well, that
borrow
was the
some
50s.
more.
You can get away with it a lot.
So the next guy, what's mind blowing? So Elmer Bernstein is the next guy I'm going to mention. What's mind blowing to me is that he studied under Aaron Copland, who is like probably the most famous American composer of like classical music of all time.
Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, so he did.
I have on vinyl, by the way.
Do you?
Of course you do.
Logan's vinyl collection. Pause. You can't even fathom it. Like you can't move in his apartment. There's so much stuff in there.
It's about to get bigger.
But he did The Magnificent Seven, 10 Commandments, The Great Escape, To Kill a Mockingbird, Ghostbusters, Animal House, True Grit, the OG one.
He's done a lot of very different kind of movies.
Blues Brothers, yeah, like all over the place.
Yeah.
Jerry Goldsmith, are we familiar with him?
Chinatown, I believe.
Chinatown, yeah, Logan's Run, Patton, Planet. So something interesting about him. I'll mention this in a minute. Let me just read these credits: The Omen, Alien, Gremlins, LA Confidential, The Mummy, Mulan.
Great movies.
Basic Instinct, Total Recall, Poltergeist, Twilight Zone. So he did Planet of the Apes, and going off your point of people who are extremely diverse as writers, Jerry Goldsmith, is doing like Patton, Chinatown, these classic orchestral scores. Planet of the Apes is well known for having one of the first entirely avant-garde film scores of all time. And what's interesting to me, if you look at like the movement of film scores too, like I mean, this guy Elmer Bernstein started under Aaron Copland. Like this guy John Williams, they're intentionally writing populist music, but then you have these people like Vangelis or like Johan Johansson who are like influenced by Toru Takemitsu is another example, like the most abstract, avant-garde, weird music you can possibly think of. But they all write great movie music. It's really interesting how diverse it is.
And when you mentioned Alien, and if I remember that film correctly, the score is very... It's pretty sparse,
yeah,
right?
it's like minimalist. And,
Very
yeah.
minimalist, because the film itself, that
It's
was kind of the
minimalist.
point of the film as
Yeah.
well. But like you mentioned the films he's done, and then he does a horror film like Alien, which is surprisingly actually a very scary movie, you know?
Yeah, like he's...
Very, very diverse.
So next guy I have written down is Maurice, either Jar or Jari. He did some movie that apparently is really famous that I had never heard of before called Lawrence of Arabia. I don't know if you guys know that movie.
Yeah, a little movie.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
I actually haven't seen it, believe it or not.
You might have to watch that.
Yeah, it's something
It's
like
quite
4
good.
hours long. So he did Dr. Zhivago,
It's longer than 4 hours.
Witness, Ghost,
No, it's not.
The Dead Poets Society, The Longest Day, Gorillas in the Mist, Fatal Attraction, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome.
The worst
Tin
of the
Drum,
Mad Maxes.
Eyes Without a Face. So he's famous. He's interesting because a lot of these movies aren't as well known or as like all-time greatest as some of the others, but he was really, really sought after as a composer. Max Steiner. This is the guy whose credits maybe blow me away the most.
Yeah, this is going to be a pretty crazy list.
King
Will
Kong,
read it to us earlier.
King Kong, Casablanca, Gone with the Wind, The Searchers, The Informer, Adventures of Don Juan, Treasure of Sierra Madre, Arsenic and Old Lace, The Beast with Five Fingers, which is not a major
Pretty much
movie.
golden age of
but
cinema right there.
I love that movie, so I mentioned it. Key Largo with Humphrey Bogart. I mean, that is insane.
Like Logan said, the golden age of cinema was basically his. And it's funny because, like, unless you're a musician or really into music or scores, like, when you said Max Steiner, I'm like, I don't know what he did. And then you mentioned all these movies. I've seen most of them. And I'm like, well, I didn't know he did the music for that. And it's like, unless you follow these guys, you don't really know how influential some of these people were and how many of your favorite films they did the music for. When you start looking, you're like, damn, you kind of see
It's
a
just
pattern.
insane,
It's crazy.
So one more guy I'm going to mention, then we can do our kind of wrap-up, concluding thoughts.
And I have one question I want to ask you guys when we do that.
Okay, this one is for Mike, because
boy.
it's a Russian.
Oh,
if
boy.
you don't know,
and
Mike
I
is
probably
Russian.
don't know. This is going to be embarrassing.
Dmitry Tiomkin.
Yeah, I don't know.
He was a classically trained composer. His life is really interesting. He was born in Russia, grew up in Russia, obviously, left Russia after the revolution, went to Berlin, stock market crashed, inflation, Germany was in a horrible state at the time. Obviously, the Nazis were around the corner, moved to America, which is interesting because it's like the Great Depression. Oh, I'm going to move to the U.S. Like, he could have gone to London. Like,
yeah.
Okay, so he did the scores for It's a Wonderful Life,
Okay.
High Noon, Gunfight at OK Corral, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Strangers on a Train, The Thing from Another World, Dial M for Murder, Giant, Rio Bravo, Guns of the Navarone.
And I moved to the U.S. when I was 5, so obviously I don't know a whole lot about, famous Russian composers, stuff like that. And I've seen a handful of Russian films, but not a ton. So the name didn't strike out to me. I'm sure my parents and people I know would know the name very well. But then you mention all these movies, and it's just like...
It's just insane.
It's crazy.
Yeah. And, we can talk about this in a different podcast, and I 100% understand that there were so many abuses committed by the old studio system, and it was unfair to women, it was unfair basically to everyone who wasn't a white man. But
these all are pretty much all white men except the Asian.
Yeah, as a system of getting extremely creative people to work together to produce their best work, I think the old studio system was amazing.
Yeah.
And the Japanese studio system was very similar in like the 50s and 60s, and then it kind of fell apart. But like that idea of like everyone is in the same place, like the writers are all working together, the directors are in-house, the composers are in-house, and it just works. Like you hire creative people and you keep them there and they make their best work. And it's not like this thing of like, I have to come up with some extremely high concept premise that's going to convince some idiot who knows nothing about movies to give me $100 million. It's like... You know what I mean? Like
it was all together. Works. It's like we mentioned Hans Zimmer earlier, and I can't remember if I heard it speaking, and basically the way I forget what movie it was. It might have been Inception or whatever. Nolan came to his house. They sat around, discussed the tone and the music they want. Then he made it and sent it to Nolan. So, like you're saying, they weren't together with the actors and crew. He went to his house. He worked alone. He sent the music to Nolan. Nolan was in his space. Then he got it ready to go. Then they went to the crew. So like it's all fragmented. It's not together. Whereas, like you said, back in the golden age, they'd all be on the studio lots, all working together.
And they rapid fire put these things out. Like they made like a lot of these directors are doing like the composers are doing like maybe a couple of scores a year. The directors are doing like one movie a year.
The composers back then probably went from one office to the next on the same studio. That's why they made so many movies.
So and this is like again, the Japanese studio system is a little bit different, but Kurosawa, and I'm just going to mention this quickly, and then Mike has this question, but and I'm going to list some movies rapid fire. 1948 to 1965. How long is that? 17 years?
17, yeah.
Okay. Kurosawa did Drunken Angel, The Quiet Duel, Stray Dog. I'm going to forget some of these, I'm sure. He did Scandal, Rashomon, Idiot, Ikiru, Seven Samurai, I Live in Fear, Throne of Blood, The Lower Depths, The Hidden Fortress.
Redbeard.
Redbeard was 65. I'm trying to go in order because that's how I remember them.
Good job, Logan.
The Bad Sleep Well, Yojimbo, Sanjuro, High and Low, Redbeard. And like 7 or 8 of those movies are like all-time classic movies of all time. Mm-hmm. And that's in a period of just 17 years because they were in the same space. They had the screenwriters there. They had the composers there. Like
plus, they make a movie. They don't have to, like you said, they don't have to go beg for money. It's like you make a movie.
There, and make a movie. And like the set for Drunken Angel, for instance, was the post-war Tokyo. And the studio was in post-war Tokyo. And they're making a lot of movies about post-war Tokyo. So you're just jumping on another movie set that's already there, and
you take that composer with you, and that's how you get 200, 300 composing credits.
Yeah. So Mike has a question for us.
So just to wrap up, we talked about all these scores, and I don't want to put you guys on the spot and be like, tell me like your favorite scores, but give me 3 of like scores you really like. Could be your favorite. You don't have to put them in order, and I can go first or last, or
why don't you kick us off?
So I already mentioned Blade Runner, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And one that might surprise people and that is completely random is The Guest. If you've seen that movie, it's so synthy and so weird. And so it has such an 80s vibe to it.
Actually, fun fact, speaking of music.
So fun. Simon Moore did that.
The guys who did the score for Stranger Things, they have a song in The Guest. And the Duffer Brothers saw The Guest, heard that song, and were like, we want that music for Stranger Things, and that's how they got the Stranger Things score.
And now it's like you said, it's a whole new wave of music with like retro wave and synth wave and like all this kind of stuff, and it has that kind of a feel to it. I really like that film as well, but I remember being a very, very good score, which is completely different than Blade Runner or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But those are 3 of mine.
Or do you want me to go and then you can go last?
Yeah, I'm so bad at doing things.
I'll go last and give yourself a second.
You mean you'll go right now?
I'll go now. And then, so Apocalypse Now is one of my all-time favorite
Yeah.
movies. So I would have to say that because I don't think you can separate the music from that movie. It's so interwoven. I might say 400 Blows, and this is funny because a lot of the music from 400 Blows I don't remember, but the main theme, the opening title music, which is about 2.5, 3 minutes long to that movie, is one of my favorite pieces of music ever, and I have it on my computer and I just listen to it all the time. I would say I've been listening to the Mandy score a lot recently. I'm not going to say that's one of my favorite scores of all time, but I'm really into it right now. And then, I just really I love Tarantino. I like the music from his films. I'd have to say, if I'm going all time, I'd have to say the Toru Takemitsu music because I listen to that a lot, especially the Qui-Gon suite that he did.
Yeah. And I'm not saying these are our top scores of all time or these are the
we
best.
Didn't even mention Johnny Greenwood.
These are just fun scores that we like.
It's so hard to pick.
It's so hard to pick. Although I will say, Blade Runner and The Good, the Bad, the Ugly are probably my number 1 and 2 scores of all time. But
and the new Blade Runner was co-written by Hans Zimmer,
which I didn't mind. Obviously, I don't think it's as good as the original, but a lot of people really hated it. And I didn't really get the hate because
they hated the movie, not just the music.
The music and the movie, and I didn't get that.
That's weird
with the music because
I liked that movie,
and I'm like, you can't really complain about the music in that if you liked the original because yes, it's not the same, but it's close.
Kind of the same,
it's kind of the same. It's a lot of similar stuff. It's like,
all right, Logan.
What do you got, Logan?
Am I allowed to do video game scores in here? Or,
do whatever you feel like.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm going to say there's this video game from 1992, I believe. Thunder Force 4, which is actually coming out on vinyl in 2019.
Is someone pre-ordering it, maybe?
Oh, data discs. I've ordered everything from data discs from a certain point.
I saw you even have a rapport with them on Instagram.
A little bit. They've liked some of my comments. Duck You Sucker and Venus Wars, I guess, is another anime. So check
them out.
Yeah, yes. Check them out. These are just things that people.
I like a lot of video game and anime stuff more than maybe regular soundtrack.
If you have any interest in any of those, check them out. I'm sure they're all good.
I'm gonna throw a monkey wrench in here at the very last minute. One thing I really wanted to mention, and I didn't write it in my notebook. I have it on my phone. Theremin scores, I think, were really influential on science fiction in particular. If you don't know what a theremin is, it's a musical instrument that you don't actually touch. You manipulate the air around it, and it makes sounds. Mm-hmm. And you use one hand.
Forbidden Planet, right? Did they?
What's that?
Did Forbidden Planet use it? No.
I wouldn't be surprised. It's a very strange sounding instrument. Like Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin used it.
I know what you're talking about.
So I looked up kind of the origins of theremin music in film scores, and there's a guy from Hungary called Miklos Rózsa. Obviously, I don't speak Hungarian, so who knows if I'm pronouncing this correctly. But he wrote 3 film scores in, I think, like the 40s or 50s, where he used theremin, and they could only find like one guy in LA who could play the theremin, and he was like a dentist or something. Awesome. And he became a celebrity, and he toured, and like
so he was already making money, and he made even more money.
I found this really great article about it. The guy's name was Hoffman. Dr. Samuel Hoffman. He was a chiropractor. And he was like the theremin player in LA. So he went on tour and became a celebrity. But like Danny Elfman uses some theremin in like Mars Attacks. But if you hear the instrument, you will recognize it right away from like 50s sci-fi movies.
I can picture it in my mind, yeah.
So anyway, there you go. Thank you for listening. This has been The Danger Zone. We hope you learned something or at least enjoyed listening to us talk about film scores. And we will be back.
See you guys.
Adios.